Welcome everyone, I'm Ben Hansen. I've been reporting on a series of UAP events that have spanned the globe and have been observed by dozens and dozens of pilots and other crew over the past summer and perhaps over the past year or more. I want to give you an update on those sightings and some possible explanations for the majority of those events. Before I do, however, I want to clarify a couple of points on how we conduct research with these UAP incidents. I say we because this is a collaborative effort, and I've been working in conjunction with a handful of people from investigative media outlets you might know, and my research partner that I'll introduce in an upcoming video. I'll start by saying that it's tempting for some who have seen the videos recorded by these pilots to come out after hearing a fairly reasonable explanation and declare that the case is solved. Some will use phrases such as completely debunked or no doubt it's explained. I really appreciate those who reserve making final conclusions until they have the full picture. And I like those who do their own research and don't just cherry pick, the points made by other people. When someone utilizes the scientific method in its purest form, they don't speak in such definitive terms. Instead, we speak in matters of percentages or likelihoods that a theory might explain an observation. Theories are refined, they're retested. We also have to be transparent about the limitations of our data or where the theory falls short to explain, outlier events or information. That's why I highly respect those who are willing to admit when something is really unusual, perplexing, and I respect those who don't resort to, personal attacks, especially acrimonious and baseless commentary towards the researchers or towards the witnesses. That really does nothing to add value to the conversation. So what I'm trying to say is that I will converse and collaborate with anyone who's respectful and objective in their reasoning. So now that I've laid that out, let's talk about racetrack UAPs. When I first started using the term to describe what the pilots were seeing, I believe I inadvertently created a situation where it's easy to just lump similar cases into this, sort of homogeneous pile. It's true that many of these characteristics are shared, such as how they brighten intensely, they dim, move in a circular pattern, or how they mostly appear in some, part of the sky. But as we talk about theories that may explain most of these sightings, we also have some outlier events that are mixed in there. I'm going to address some of those accounts that don't fit this proposed theory in a future video, and then it will be up to you to decide if A, the theory is good enough and can account for observational errors, B, we're dealing with a whole other phenomena that happens to coincide with these similar events, or C, the possibility that our theory is just entirely wrong. And I, of course, have been often entirely wrong in my life, and I'm okay with that. So let's jump right into this. It's going to be a longer video, but I feel it's necessary given the importance of these events, so I apologize. At this point, we've directly communicated or interviewed over 25 different pilots, flight attendants, air traffic controllers, involved in more than 40 separate commercial flights that have witnessed similar UAPs in the past several months. So as this has always been a developing case, the list of witnesses has grown and grown. And I've never felt confident giving my opinions on the most likely explanations until we had the fullest picture possible of testimonies and videos. Now, most of those who quickly made conclusions on this phenomena have not had the access we've had to talk directly to the witnesses. Now, I don't necessarily fault them for this, but it's taken hundreds of hours to conduct interviews, to sift through the data, and we didn't want to prematurely form our opinions. Now, if you've been following these reports, the predominant theory is that these objects are satellites, specifically that they are most likely Starlink satellites launched by SpaceX, due to the sheer number that we're now seeing, and perhaps because of the relatively low orbiting altitude. This is the theory that I want to focus on today. So if you watched the first video I produced on the subject, you remember that my initial report was actually the first one to propose the idea that these might be satellites. Now, admittedly, I said at the time that it was not a plausible likelihood based on the information we currently had, and that was true. We'll discuss the information that now exists and how I may have underestimated that likelihood based on what we knew at the time. But here's an excerpt of that previous segment. Consider that there's 3,000 to 4,000 Starlink satellites in orbit right now, and we didn't even have these just a few years ago. So here you can see the Starlink tracker, and you can see just how far north some of those Starlink orbits go. So is it possible that what we're seeing are individual Starlink satellites? I'm not talking about the whole long train of them. I'm saying after they've dispersed, could they be coming through individually one after another in some section of the sky where the sun is reflecting on them? Second, you may also remember that the concept of satellites reflecting the sun's light and flaring up was also not a new idea to us. I addressed that in the first video. I provided examples of tutorials that I had posted online like 6 years ago, when I don't believe that anybody else was doing a similar breakdown to help people understand what they were seeing. So if I already addressed the satellite theory, you're thinking, why am I revisiting this? Well, I feel that we now have better video and far more interviews that do support the satellite theory, but at the same time, vastly support the idea that these are highly unusual presentations and uncommon orbits that people are not used to seeing. I will make this point over and over, that I believe by far these pilots' observations of the events were deadly accurate, and for pilots with all their experience deciphering what should and should not be in the sky, it would take a UAP event that is highly unusual for them to take notice and to come forward with all the challenges that entails before that they would make a report. So, sometime after I made the initial video describing these events, a few researchers that post on the Metabunk website and other outlets expounded on the satellite theory. You can watch a video by researcher Mick West here and his review of findings by contributor Flarkey. Now, they used another satellite tracking website called inthesky.org. I actually think it's a pretty cool website where you can put in your date, time, location, and it shows you which satellites would be in your visual plane and even whether they might be expected to be reflecting the sun's light or not. Now, in Mick's latest post, and I put a link here in the video description, they've had really good specific data as to the star field in the background of a particular video that Mick was able to use and then overlay a real-time simulation of where the Starlink satellites would have been in relation to the brightening UAPs. And they match up. Now, Mick makes the excellent point that not even the tracking programs could predict that the satellites would be visible, because the night vision scope that was used can see objects that are much dimmer than what the unaided eye can see. Now, in the case of pilots who are flying tens of thousands of feet, in altitude, he points out that they have much clearer skies. They also have a greater view of the horizon. But as good as these online tracking tools are, I would also add that they are estimations of where the satellites should be. As the website states, they download a data set from Racetrack, which derives its information from NORAD every day, so they can update their database. But I spent several hours or so after midnight watching the website track current satellites in the northern sky. So I even put in the very northern latitude of Chicago, where some of these pilots recorded events, to give the best chance of catching one of these northern satellite orbits and the flares. And just like I had shown in my first video, boom, okay, there's a gazillion satellites on the northern horizon, but that I already knew. Nearly every one of those satellites near the Big Dipper, where lots of the events occurred, was a Starlink satellite. But for quite a while, not one of them indicated it would be visible from the ground. Now, every now and then, one colored in red would creep up near the horizon. So as you can see, red indicates that the satellite could be visible from the ground because it has an apparent magnitude of 12 to 5. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail of how celestial objects are graded with their magnitude of brightness, but it's done on a logarithmic scale, so by powers of 10, and it's in reverse. Okay, so the lower the number, the brighter the object is. It also goes into negative numbers. So to give you an idea, the star Sirius has a magnitude of negative 1.46, and Merak, the star in the Big Dipper, a lot of these pilots reference, That's 2.37. So if you look here in the website tracker, they color code satellites from red, then orange, then yellow, once they reach a magnitude of 1 or even -1. Like a bright star, like Sirius. But just because a satellite is coded as red doesn't mean that they're going to see it. The human eye can normally only see something that has a magnitude 6 or brighter unless you're looking at the object through some type of magnification like a telescope. So realistically, the website would only indicate a satellite you might see tracking across the sky with your unaided eye if it's color-coded at least orange or yellow. So incidentally, I spent several hours monitoring the live website in the middle of the night, which is when many of these reports occurred, and I never once saw a satellite coded orange or yellow. I even turned on all the available satellite selections, so you can see here on the screen. I looked at the entire sky. I couldn't find an orange or yellow coded satellite. Now, obviously, this data depiction isn't totally accurate, because you can go to a rural area outside of Chicago where it's dark, and you can see at least some satellites at all hours of the night, if they're in deep orbit. So what am I getting at? I'm making the point that as good as these online satellite trackers are, they have their limitations. They're not 100% accurate as to depicting what you might expect to see in the sky and when you might expect to see it. Now, Mick did an excellent job lining up the corresponding satellites in the night vision video. But I was getting a lot of people asking me for the exact coordinates and timestamps for the numerous pilot videos that we have. For example, from the Hawaiian airline flights that we have coming across the Pacific. Well, not only do most of those videos not have enough stars for reference to know exactly where it happened in the sky, but most cell phone cameras also don't provide the EXIF data in their videos that saves the time data to the exact second. The best you'll get is a timestamp to a specific minute. But even if the time is accurate, these UAP events happen precisely over a few seconds. So, unfortunately, a website satellite tracker in this case isn't going to give us proof positive the validation that we wish we had. So, is the website useful? Absolutely. I think it does a great job at illustrating in which direction different orbits occur. It also gives us a really good idea of where certain clusters of satellites pass through. I'm even okay that the satellites aren't represented correctly as when they would be visible. Why? Because if most of these cases are satellites, we're most interested in when they flare up and reflect the sun's light, and not when they are dimly lit, tracking the sky and not visible. It would be nice, but we're really not going to get a satellite tracker to tell us when they flare based on the data that it's providing. But I'm fine settling for some basic, location data. So now on to chapter 2 of this mystery. One of the most puzzling aspects of these Racetrack UAPs is that many pilots describe them revolving in a circular pattern. Now, are the objects truly making course reversals? Are they looping back to their starting point? If so, the incredible G-forces exerted on any aircraft or satellite at the speeds judged from the distance that they're at would almost instantly rule out any human-made technology. So if these are satellites, I made the point in the previous videos that it's extremely rare to see a satellite orbit going from east to west. I discussed how satellites are typically launched in the same direction as the rotation of the Earth, and for most practical purposes, you wouldn't even want a satellite going in what's called pure retrograde, flying against the spin of the Earth, because now it's flying over the ground too fast to be useful, for photo surveillance, weather, or communication purposes. And yet, we now have multiple videos of these UAPs being filmed, normally to the north, and they move from both right to left and left to right. In other words, it appears they are also flying from east to west. Now, we recently obtained a video from a commercial flight where the pilot wishes to remain anonymous. He has seen these UAPs multiple times now, and he was so amazed that on one of his flights, he brought along an inexpensive pair of digital night vision binoculars. Now, this was taken on October 20th, and what you're seeing took place toward the northwest, when the flight was just east of St. Louis, Missouri. I sent the video to a professional forensic video analyst to stabilize, but they were unable to do much with it because the timestamp burned in the bottom left corner there. That was messing up with the tracking program. By the way, the time is incorrect, so please ignore the date. It was not 2021. This happened just a month ago in 2022. Because of the low light capability of the binoculars, they're better than the average cell phone, we're able to get a much better understanding of what might be going on. Now, even though I couldn't stabilize the video very well, you can see one of these objects going from the bottom of the screen to the upper right. Now watch the stars in the background as reference points as to where it passes by. Now later, a second one passes through in the exact same pathway, and it lights up in the same spot and then dims away again, just like the first one. This pattern forms a diagonal favoring west to east, just like the satellite trackers depict. And you can see that here. Now that would indicate that several objects are following in a procession in a specific orbital plane. And they're reflecting the sun's light in exactly the same spot because we're going to call this a hot zone. The light of the sun is just perfect enough to peek over the polar horizon, even though we can't see the sun from where we're at. Now, Mick West demonstrates this principle and how the direct beam of the reflection most likely misses the ground here on Earth. But pilots may be high enough up in altitude that they catch a glimpse of it. The shallow angle of the reflection does make sense as to why these events are rarely seen on the ground. Now, this is something that I had considered previously, but one of the main sticking points, I couldn't get my head around it, was why we are also seeing these objects go from right to left or seemingly going in retrograde if they're common satellites. You see this one coming here. It's coming up from the bottom. It's more of a northwesterly direction. But the Hawaii video is also going from right to left, and several videos we have received since. Recently, even astronomers in South Africa were baffled because they were filming streaks of light that were going both directions. We reached out to SpaceX for some technical commentary, so have a number of other media outlets we're working with, but to our frustration, nobody has responded to our request at the time of making this video. So I wanted to know about the various orbital planes of Starlink, but all we have is public reports that it appears Starlink is approved to operate in at least 72 different orbital planes. They've also applied for permits to operate in several different altitude shells, that we'll call them. They range from what is considered very low Earth orbit at 210 miles up. Then there's others at 340 miles and on up to over 700 miles. Now, to give you an idea of the relative distance, geostationary satellites are over 100 times farther away than the lowest Starlinks. The lowest ones are even slightly below the space station, which is in low Earth orbit. I spent more time looking at satellite trackers, and initially I could see that there were these west to east orbital planes with Starlink, and occasionally you'd see one coming directly from the top or up from the bottom. But it did take quite a while, and then sure enough, a cluster of Starlinks would move diagonally to the upper left or in a westerly direction. Now, it doesn't happen often, but they seem to come in groups. And I thought about it, someone at SpaceX probably would take like 2 seconds to explain this to me. But since they weren't answering us, I came up with my own theory, and it has to do with polar orbits. Now, starting in January of 2021, SpaceX launched its first series of satellites in a southern direction so that they can deploy them in a polar orbit. But to really explain how I think this works, I need to take you into my high-tech and very expensive laboratory. So please excuse the crudity of the model. I didn't have time to build it to scale or to paint it. Now here we have the Earth, which I found on Facebook Marketplace, and of course the Sun, which provides this nice diffuse light, which will simulate a shadowed Earth on the other side. Now, along with the Sun, I have a green laser mounted that represents the precise center ray of the sun's light that provides the most intense incident beam. Now, only when this direct beam hits the satellite at the perfect angle, will we actually be able to see it reflect the light? And of course, we also have our little satellite. Now this is made from a steel ball from one of my favorite board games, Mousetrap. And we have some tinfoil which will simulate the solar panels of the satellite, which I am holding with this pointing device. Now let's start with the summertime sightings in the northern hemisphere, when the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees towards the sun. So in the daytime, it would be like this. And there's the United States, but it's nighttime, so we're going to move it towards the back side over here. Now in a standard satellite orbit that goes towards the east, and we can go kind of actually northeast here, the satellite is really quite close to their surface. But at high enough latitudes, it just peaks up enough over the Earth's curvature that it catches the direct beam from the sun. Like that. And as it continues, it dips back into the shadow, or it goes over the horizon. Now, one thing that is highly unusual about these sightings, though, is that with most satellites you can see, they track across the sky for quite some time, at least dimly lit, before they go into the Earth's shadow. Now, if most of these reports are satellites, you can see why they're so baffling to even experienced pilots and astronomers. Not only are they extremely bright, but that hot zone where they're visible is so incredibly small that it's like pulling back the curtain to a very small window to peer into the other side. The objects only show up within a small region of just a few degrees wide. Now let's suppose we launch one of these Starlinks from either Cape Canaveral in Florida or Vandenberg in California like they do, but this time we want to send it in a southern direction because we're going to put it in polar orbit. Now I think they've done this with dozens of launches at this point. So let's say we even go a little bit southeast, and as we come down here, actually let's use our satellite. As we come down towards the southeast, it's going to continue, and it's going to go down underneath Antarctica. Now, if you imagine it coming back up over the back side of the Earth now, as it comes around, it's going to continue doing this southeastern orbit. And it'll continue doing that, right? It doesn't seem like it changes, but remember, the Earth is also rotating underneath the orbit. So if you were to actually look on the back side of it, as it comes up underneath, it's going to continue, but this time it's coming to the north and going to the northeast. So that same satellite is coming down across the Earth, and it's also coming up in this crisscross pattern. Now let's say just for fun, we don't want to just go south, we're going to go a little bit southwest as we deploy this satellite. And now as it tracks a little bit southwest, you can see as it comes around the back side, we'll pretend now that it's coming up over here, that southwest direction as it comes up is now heading northwest. In other words, it's semi-retrograde now. And here's how that looks on the tracking websites. And when it's video recorded in the upper latitudes, it may appear as sort of an oblique angle as it comes mostly towards us or is going away from us. So we do see them going in both directions. And there's a whole lot of them. They kind of line up in clusters. They make a complete orbit in a little over 90 minutes. So because of these new polar orbits, we see a lot more satellites going right to left and a lot of orbits that are in close proximity to each other. And they can be really bright. I didn't realize it until I started researching all of the problems that SpaceX is having to reduce the albedo of the satellite surfaces. That's albedo, not libido. It's the reflectivity caused by the Starlink antennas, the solar array. They tried a number of things, from creating sun visors to block the reflections to putting special coatings on the panels. So I know what you're thinking, case solved. Now we know these are just satellites, right? This is important because I'm going to say this over and over again in subsequent videos. I now feel fairly confident that we have a reasonable explanation for the majority of these sightings. However, we now have a good half a dozen cases or more where pilots have reported other aspects of these Racetrack UAPs either seen in conjunction with what might be satellites or in completely separate events. But in these outlier events, the objects were clearly seen doing unconventional maneuvering, such as taking 90-degree turns, course reversals, stopping for a few seconds, and then shooting off in hundredths of a second towards the ocean. The former F-18 pilot Mark reported one of these events that I would consider an outlier event, where the objects he witnessed changed position from a northern location where they were circling to moving in a western position above his aircraft as he tracked toward Hawaii. In addition to an object he witnessed streak down like a meteor and then joined the other UAPs in their circling. In a video we'll soon release, my research partner Brittany and I will go over the details of some of these incredible sightings. So please subscribe or follow the other social media notifications so that you can see when these reports are about to come out. So to wrap up, in full transparency, I have yet to find stabilized video that clearly shows any of the non-linear trajectories of these objects that many have reported seeing. We can see a slight curvature in some of them, but this might be just from the way that it's following the Earth's curvature on the horizon. Having said that, I want to stress this very strongly. We do not feel that any of the dozens of pilots that we've interviewed have in any way embellished their descriptions or have given inaccurate details. In fact, I think they've been extremely accurate in both what they described and what they feel they wish they would have captured on video. They often admit the video just didn't capture the right moment. So just because they don't have video of it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And yes, pilots, they can make judgments of error, but they also spend thousands of hours scanning the skies, more than 99.9% of the average person. And I've read quite insulting and ignorant comments to the effect of, pilots are idiots if they don't know what satellites look like, or they shouldn't be flying if they don't know what a meteor is. The fact is, we wouldn't be learning about these incidents that have baffled dozens of air traffic controllers, hundreds of military and commercial aviators, and astronomers if this was commonplace and easy to identify. And if we want this to be more confidently explained as being Starlink or some other new satellite configuration, then there are still a handful of characteristics of these events that are unresolved. I'm not even talking about the outlier events that I mentioned we'll report on later. I'm saying that for the cases we do believe are most likely satellites, there are unresolved issues that require explanation. And it's very frustrating that the satellite experts at SpaceX, they've remained silent. I don't know, maybe they don't want to draw any more attention to the light pollution issues their satellites have caused, or maybe they don't want to admit that they're part of a larger problem now with hundreds of pilots and controllers becoming distracted as they report on these events. Then you have the FAA, who doesn't have answers. At least the frontline workers, who are the radar controllers, their supervisors, who are frustrated because nobody is devoting the resources to do follow-up investigations. If they're satellites, you would hope we could clear it all up by having a detailed explanation from the space agencies responsible, and then having that information, disseminated to the pilots so that they're aware of the new normal should they observe them. I'm not sure that that's going to happen for whatever reason, but here's a short list of just some of the unresolved issues. Now, most of the sightings are towards the north. It makes sense because the higher latitudes would be the best place to see these new polar orbits as the satellites catch the sun's rays, even in the middle of the night. But we now have numerous sightings that take place to the east and directly to the west, and not just in the hours following dusk or dawn when satellites are most likely to be seen. The physics of satellite altitudes and the sun's reflection normally only allow for the very deepest orbits to be seen in the middle of the night, with the exception of these new polar latitudes. But remember that Starlinks orbit very, very low, and they likely wouldn't catch the reflection in these middle latitudes at that time of night. So could these particular sightings be Starlinks that are in a higher orbital shell, or maybe completely different satellite constellations. That's always possible. Number two, it seems like we saw a peak of these events in the summer months. This is when here in the northern hemisphere, the Earth is tilted more towards the sun. So the theory is that in the summer, our northern latitudes are in a better position to see these polar Starlink orbits. However, I now have multiple reports from the southern hemisphere in places like Brazil over the past few months and Australia, which happened in June, which it's actually winter there at that point. So only time will tell if the seasons really make any difference or if we're going to be seeing these all year round due to, orbital configurations that we don't yet understand. Number three, and this goes along with the other two, the brightness of these objects is unbelievable. A principal reason why Starlinks are so bright is because they're in such low Earth orbit. Now, that's not the only reason they're bright, but if these things are seen in the middle latitudes, in the middle of the night, or when it's winter in your hemisphere, then it's more likely that they would also have to be in a much higher orbit than Starlinks. But when you put a satellite in a deeper orbit, it's also less likely that they're going to be bright. But these are bright, no matter where they're seen. A deep orbit is probably not going to be Starlink. So again, are we maybe looking at a different type of satellite in the mix? And finally, number four, the lack of tracking across the sky. We've mentioned this before, but I don't have one report of these Racetrack UAPs being at least dimly visible across most of the sky. They only show up in a small opening that spans a few degrees in width in certain regions of the sky. That's where they intensify and then they dim out. As I showed, that makes sense when we see them in the polar regions, but when they're seen in the middle latitudes, we're not quite understanding why they're not at least dimly visible. That might have something to do with the antenna and the solar array, characteristics of Starlink and the albedo. There's that word again. But since nobody who launches these has actually volunteered to explain it, we're only left to guess right now. So that's a summary at this point. Like I said, very soon, Brittany and I will be releasing information on what we believe are outlier events that don't fit the typical profile of the Racetrack objects we've received so many reports on. I also want to thank the dozens of pilots and air traffic controllers who we've spoken to over the past few months. Please don't let the critics, the internet trolls, or your own airline companies discourage you from reporting UAPs. You have a place here where your voice and concerns can be heard. Even if we find natural explanations for many of these events, you shouldn't feel embarrassed for feeling that what you saw was unusual. In this particular case, I'll say it again. What I called the Racetrack UAPs covers a broad range of phenomena. While I now feel confident that most of the sightings are attributed to some new configuration of satellites, it does not in any way diminish the accounts of UAP maneuvers that seem to defy the physics of human-made objects. We're following up on those cases, and you should feel free to report anytime that there are unusual craft in the skies, and you should expect that your companies and the government should feel a vested interest in finding explanations as well. So thank you. Stay tuned. There's more to come.